there are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, "Thy will be done." That is a quote from C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce. It comes from a conversation and in a larger context, but this statement in itself, you have to think about for one moment, but once you see it, it's perfectly clear. It says that there are two kinds of people. Those who submit themselves to God's will and can pray the Lord's Prayer, in which we say, "Your will be done," and those who refuse to submit to God's will, and God says to them, "Your will be done, as you please," so to speak. Now, Mark 5, verse 1 to 20 illustrates this point with great clarity and in a wonderful way. We have in this passage people who plead, or creatures who plead with Jesus, who pleads with God to do one thing, and he responds by allowing them. And then we have someone who pleads with him, who belong to him, and he refuses to give them what they wish and gives them something else instead. Think about the contrast in this passage, the way that we heard it read just now. There are those, the demons, with whom Jesus is confronted at first, who plead with him to send them into the pigs, and Jesus allows that. He permits them. Then there are the country people or the townspeople who come to see what had happened, and they plead with Jesus that he would leave them, and he does. He grants in both instances their wish to their destruction. And then finally there is the man delivered who comes and pleads with Jesus that he might be with him, and this is the one whom Jesus refuses to give what he asks for. And instead he says to him, "I give you a new duty. I give you a new mission, because you are now my subject. You have become mine, and you are in submission to me and will do my will instead." That's what we see in this passage. Now the passage itself divides itself into 4 sections. There is verse 1 to 5, which is a description, a setting of the scene, and then a description of the demon-possessed man. And then verse 6 to 13 describe Jesus' encounter with him. And then there is verses 14 to 17 describing Jesus' encounter with the townspeople. And then verses 18 to 20 describes Jesus' encounter with the man who had been set free from the demons. We won't use those 4 points as our as our thought pattern, but I give it to you so that you may know that's the structure of the passage. But we will just look at these 3 points of how the contrast is set up, because that's where the essential point of the passage comes to light. The contrast between the unbelieving groups who plead and receive their will, and the believing man who receives and who pleads for something and receives something contrary. Now the passage begins, of course, in verse 1, where we read, "They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes." Now this is, of course, after what we heard last week, how Jesus had said to his disciples, "Let us go to the other side of the lake." And they got into the boat. Well, they were already in the boat after Jesus' day of preaching from the boat. And then there was this great windstorm. Perhaps for those who weren't here, that glorious passage in which Jesus, by simply speaking 2 words, brings the sea and the wind to utter quietness. He speaks 2 simple words, and the wind and the sea obey him immediately. Now that passage ends when the disciples asks, and that's literally where the passage ends, when they ask, "Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" And then chapter 5 comes to answer that question in explicit terms. Now we would have hoped that the disciples would be the ones to actually answer that question, that they would look at what Jesus had done in saying to the wind and the sea, "Peace, be still," and it obeys him, and say, "Surely this man is the Son of God," as we have seen all throughout Mark. But they still have that question. Now perhaps they have this question because they were thinking, like the Pharisees, by what power is he saying these things? Maybe he's saying this in some form of a good kind of a power. He's a force for good, but he's like a wizard almost. Maybe that's what they were thinking. He's like a magician. And so but he's a good one. So he can say to the wind and the sea, who are almost one with him, some pantheistic kind of idea, he can say to the wind and the sea, peace be still, and it obeys him because they are two good forces entwined with one another. That's maybe a way of thinking about that. It's very unlikely that the disciples thought that, but maybe that's still possible. The alternative would be to say what the Pharisees had said, and that he was doing the great things that he did by the power of the devil. And that's the question that might still be lingering there. Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey? Well, is it not possible that Satan has this kind of power over some of the forces of nature? It's possible. And so then this passage comes and it shows us, no, it's not that power. It's not by the power of Satan, because Jesus is utterly opposed to the power of Satan revealed in this passage. Gloriously, it is then the demons who ultimately are able to say exactly who Jesus is in this passage. And that's what we'll see. Now, verse 1 tells us that they came to the opposite side, and there's probably still night, still at least early morning. It's fairly dark. And so we have to see the picture as this unfolds. We are told that a man immediately came and met with Jesus. We are told that in verse 2. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. Now that word, the word met, to set up a meeting or to have a meeting with someone, I don't think to most of our minds brings across quite the picture that we have to have in our minds here. Usually when we say, I have a meeting with someone, or maybe you have a meeting at work and it's one of those meetings that you have so much fear about before going into that meeting that's more the idea that you should have in mind here, but not entirely. But usually when we say we have a meeting with someone, it's positive, it's a friendly thing. We're just meeting with someone. That's not the idea. In fact, this word goes very far beyond that. The word used here is also used in Luke chapter 14, verse 31, where it's used of kings who meet each other in battle. They have their battle lines drawn up. They have their armies standing in a straight line, opposing one another with some space in the middle so that they can start running at each other and attack one another. That's the picture that I'm sure you've all seen movies where this happened. That's the idea. This man met with Jesus. They were squared up, opposing one another. They meet in battle. It's a duel, or at least that's what it looks like. In verse 6, we'll actually see that this man was running toward Jesus. The picture is almost like that of the creation myths. Again, and we heard something of this last week. The creation myths of the ancient Near Eastern peoples were always two forces coming at each other, and then you just see which one comes up on top. So basically, in the ancient Near Eastern creation myths, it always works this way. There is the God of the people of that nation, whichever ancient Near Eastern nation, and they have their God, and then there is the God of the forces of chaos. And the creation myth, the story of how everything came to be, then takes their God and these forces of chaos, and they collide, and the collision brings forth creation. Okay, and usually it means that their God somehow came out on top. Now in the Bible, the account of creation in Genesis 1 takes some of those creation myth ideas, but it does so in such a way as to say those creation myths are utter nonsense. It does so in the way that says, when God created the heavens and the earth, there was no contest. He was there even before the forces, the so-called forces of chaos, had existed. And that's actually the picture that we see here again. This man runs to Jesus. It's almost like there's a duel that will take place, but then in typical biblical fashion, there is really no contest at all. The man falls down on his face and essentially worships Jesus. And that's what we'll see just now. Now we have to just think about this for a moment and picture this in our minds. The passage actually wants us to do this. It tells us some details about this man. Now, one way to try and think of this and to make it vivid in our minds, we have to think ourselves into the shoes of the disciples. And the passage doesn't actually tell us what the disciples thought, what the disciples saw. It's not put in those terms. So that's not the point of the passage at all. But for us to see the passage unfold, that this is a useful way of thinking about it. Think about the disciples. They were with Jesus in the boat. They had just seen him quiet the storm, and now they step onto shore. Most likely early morning, still fairly dark. And you have this man, and he will be described now, running at you. Now listen to his description. Verses 3 to 5. He lived among the tombs. That's the first thing that we see about him. He lived among the tombs. Now, even in our minds, it can be scary enough to think about someone living in the graveyards. But this is much worse. What you have to understand is to live among the tombs, it actually says lived in the tombs, was what they had for tombs was a tomb, not a grave. They didn't dig a hole into the ground. Instead, they had hewn out holes into a rock wall, a cliff side of some kind. So they would dig a hole, but it would be into the side of the mountain, into the side of a cliff. And then the people would be laid in there. Okay? So this man lived in the tombs. He was living in those holes in the side of the mountain. That's where he slept, if he slept, when he slept. That's where he spent his time. You see, a dead person would be put into that hewn out hole into the wall, into the side of the cliff. And then those spaces would eventually, after those bodies had decomposed, would be opened up. It would be opened up again. And so this man lived inside those holes. That's where he slept. That's where he put his head. This man lives among the dead. He's described as essentially being one of the dead people. He lived among the tombs. Really, he walked among the tombs. It's not real life in any real sense. And this is actually a great picture of what we are apart from Christ. Think about how the Apostle Paul describes us apart from Christ in Ephesians 2, verse 1 and 2. You were dead in your trespasses and sins in which you walked, following the prince of the power of the air, following Satan, following the devil. Just as this man was possessed by demons, man in his natural state is dead in trespasses and sins, living among the tombs. The man is then further described as no one could bind him, not even with a chain. Now literally you could say, no chain, no longer, no one. No one could bind him any longer with any chain. And they had tried on multiple occasions. They had tried to bind him, hand and foot, all around his body. Chains were bound around him. And so he would just shatter the chains. This man had inhumane strength. Well, of course, it's not the man himself. As we'll see, he's a real person. But he is so beset with this demon or demons that he has truly inhumane strength. He shatters these shackles off of him as if it is nothing. He could not be bound. This is how he's described as inboundable, impossible to bind. Now the irony, of course, is that even though this man cannot be bound with shackles and chains, he is in bondage to Satan. He is bound by the will of these demons who possess him. He has no real freedom. Again, glorious picture of what it is to be apart from Christ. You see, the natural man thinks that he is free. He thinks that he decides for himself what he will do with himself, with his life. He thinks that he is the captain of his own ship. But in reality, man, dead in trespasses and sins, can only go after sin. That is what man is apart from Christ. Only able to sin. He's not free. We are not free apart from Christ. So this man is being bound and they couldn't bind him. Further, he is described as crying out or screaming night and day for no apparent reason. We are not told what he screams. He doesn't have a message. He just goes about screaming night and day. Demons would not allow him to rest. They would not give him any kind of peace. No, he goes about screaming night and day and cutting himself with stones. Now, verse 15 will imply that this man is naked. Well, he used to be. He will then have clothes on, but that's the point, that prior to his being saved by Jesus, he was naked. Now, see this picture. Put yourself into the shoes of the disciples. You come off the boat, you just step onto the land, probably still rattled and shaken from what you had just experienced on the lake, nearly dying, believing that you were going to die in that storm. And here you have, in the maybe vague light of early morning, you have this man with scabs on his body and dry blood all over, naked, running to you, screaming his head off. You think, what's going to happen now? You see, it looks like a duel. But then we come to verse 6. What do we see? When he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. He fell down before him. That word to fall down is the same word used for falling down in worship, to bow down before someone. This man, with the demons still in him, bowed down before Jesus, admitting, confessing that he is Lord and that they are not, that he is God and that they are creatures. They have no way of contesting the power of Christ. That's the essential point here. Christ is the all-authoritative king, and he subdues this man to himself. He subdues the demons and gives them their destruction. Now, their ultimate destruction will only take place later, but in this passage, we are shown Jesus' authority to bring them to their destruction. Verse 7 to 10 then tell us of Jesus' conversation with this man. And just this thought that this conversation could even take place has to strike us as so strange. Jesus indulges this demon-possessed man to speak with him, to have a conversation, a back and forth. But notice the conversation. Verse 7 to 10. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. The demons beg Jesus to do something for them. They beg him. Now, it seems that Jesus had already told the demons that they were being exorcised, they were being cast out. There's no further command for them to be cast out. So the ultimate end, the casting out, has already in one sense been done. The demons are just pleading in order to kind of mitigate their circumstances, trying to find a softer landing, as one pastor has said. That's what they do. They plead. They plead with him. What do you expect Jesus to say to these demons? You certainly don't expect him to give them their desire, but he does. He says, yes, because what you essentially desire is your own destruction. Because you do not submit to me truly. Yes, this man has fallen down before Jesus, but it's not true submission. Yes, he has accurately described or named Jesus for who he is. The Son of the Most High God. Now again, I remind you that when the New Testament tells us that Jesus is the Son of God, the point is not that he is below or beneath him, that he is of a lesser quality or of a lesser stature, but that he is of the same substance. That's the point of sonship in the whole of the Bible. Sonship always says, you resemble that one. And in this case, he resembles him perfectly. Jesus is of the same substance with the Father. And this is what the demons acknowledge at this point. And they plead with him, do not torment me. They recognize that this is what they deserve. They deserve at the hands of Jesus to be tormented. They deserve to be tormented because that is all what they know to do. Just notice how they have tormented this man. Now, it's important to kind of show this because in the flow of the passage, it's possible to almost begin to feel sorry for the demons. I don't know if that's just me, but they are so weak in the face of the authority of Christ that you almost begin to feel sorry for them. But you have to recognize what they do. And this is real. It's not to be made light of. They did not do anything positive for the man whom they had taken up residence in. They did not do anything for his benefit. No, instead, they were the ones responsible for him living in the tombs in the first place. They were the ones responsible for him cutting himself, for not giving him rest, for making him scream night and day. They were tormenting him. And so they come to Jesus and they plead, do not torment us. They know a thing or two about torment. They are tormentors. That's what they do. They want to take the joy from people. That's their ultimate aim. They cannot really do anything to harm God or to harm His kingdom, but they can harm people. And this is what they do and have done with this man. They do not deserve any pity. And Jesus does not show them any pity. He does not show them any mercy. He gives them their desire because that is in line with His will for them. They desire destruction. They do not desire the glory of God. And instead, they desire what they desire, and that is their destruction, even though they might not immediately realize that. And so Jesus sends them out. The passage tells us in verse 14 that there were a great herd of pigs that were feeding on the hillside. A great herd of pigs that we ultimately see numbers about 2,000 pigs. Now you have to think about what this man had been going through. He had been tormented. He had been possessed by multiple, we can say, thousands of demons. Actually, that's what his name refers to. The man says, my name is Legion, for we are many. Now, a legion was actually a term used to describe a Roman cohort of soldiers, numbering between 4,000 and 6,000. Now, it's possible if you take that number, then you could say this was possibly 4,000 to 6,000 demons, and it's actually quite likely that that's the case. But even if you were to say, well, not necessarily 4,000, then at the very least as many demons as there were pigs, which is roughly about 2,000. Could have been a little bit more, could have been a little bit less, but that's still the number, roughly 2,000. More likely, 4,000 to 6,000 demons had possessed this man, which explains the inhumane strength that he had. This, Jesus gives them their desire and sends them into the pigs. This legion of demons are sent into the pigs. They are given permission to do what they please. And they go into the pigs and they drive the pigs into the sea. Now this is a picture of their destruction. Their destruction is not necessarily immediate. That's not the point of the passage. The passage does not want to draw our attention to the theological question of when precisely the destruction of the demons will occur. That's not the point in the passage. But the point in the passage is that Jesus has this authority over them. And then the point which flows out of that, the application, the comforting application of this, is to think about what this means for us. This is the kind of authority that Jesus has over these demons. The same kind of authority that He has over creation. The same kind of authority that He has over sin. You remember how He was able to say to the man who had been paralyzed, "Your sins are forgiven." Jesus is able to deliver from any kind of bondage, even the bondage of sin, even the bondage of a legion of demons. You see, it's possible for Christians to have an experience of their salvation, but still, or know that they have been saved, but have the experience that they struggle to have the assurance that they will ultimately be saved. And that usually happens when they look at themselves and see in themselves sufficient sin to say, well, I'm so sinful, how can I ever be saved? You see, this is possible. It's possible that you might be sitting here with something of this experience. It might be that you will one day have this experience or have had it in the past, and you have struggled with this thought pattern. What if I am not ultimately saved because look at my sin. Look how great my sin is. Look at all the things that I've done. I think I'm beyond grace. You see, that's something, a thought pattern that a Christian might fall into. To think, yes, the gospel is true. Yes, Jesus did die for sin, but my sin is too much. I am beyond saving. Well, if anyone was ever beyond saving, it had to be this man. He was possessed by a legion of demons. But Jesus, with absolute calmness, with absolute authority, casts out these demons and sets this man free. So if ever you find yourself in that position where you doubt whether perhaps my sin cannot be forgiven, perhaps I am beyond grace, remember this man. And remember what Jesus had done for him. Think about him. Think about Jesus and his authority. He can forgive sin. Your sins and my sins are never so great that it cannot be forgiven by Christ. Think about again how this is put in that same chapter we heard earlier from Ephesians chapter 2, verse 4 to 6. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which He loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses and sins, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. What a glorious reality. But then our text tells us that there are always those who resist this reality. There are always those who deny that Christ truly is able to do this, or they deny that they would like this to be done for them. Now, this is what we see in verses 14 to 17. Now, Jesus had now freed this man in verses 1 to 13, and so the pigs now go down the hill and they drown in the sea. And there were those who were caring for the pigs. They were looking after them. And you can imagine what they must be going through at this point. This was their livelihood. It was their work. It was their reputation. They were taking care of the pigs, the herdsmen, the pig shepherds, the pig herders. I don't think they're called shepherds. The pig watchers. And they were taking care of these pigs. And so they immediately realized their own situation. They are in big trouble. They have now lost 2,000 pigs. How do you lose 2,000 pigs? And so they realize what they have to do. They know straight away what it is that they must do. They must make sure that everyone knows how this happened and that it wasn't their fault. And so they run into the city and they run into the field and they tell everyone what had happened. And so the people come and they want to see, they want to know what had happened. A crowd gathers around in order to know what it is that had just taken place. And so what do they find? They find this man, the man who had been possessed by the demon. He's sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. And they find Jesus who had done this for him. Now what do you expect? How do you expect these people to respond? Well, I would expect them to be overjoyed. Now, imagine you were one of the people living in that town with the man who lived in the tombs. Imagine you had to go and bury a family member in those tombs. And you had to go where this guy was, whom you had tried to bind multiple times with chains, and you couldn't because he was too strong. Imagine you lived in one of the closer by towns, and you heard this man screaming night and day. Imagine trying to put a baby to sleep or trying to fall asleep when you are perhaps already overworked and anxious, and then hearing this man scream, knowing what he looks like. You would expect these people to say, the dragon is slain, the monster is dead, we are set free. That's the response you expect. But they don't respond in that way. No, they actually show the response that we saw in the parable of the soils, the first response. They say, I would have nothing to do with this. I do not want to have anything to do with the one who set this man free. Why not? Well, the hint is in what they look at, what our attention is drawn to in terms of what they see. They see the man who had previously been under bondage of a legion of demons, sitting there, peaceful, quiet, and in his right mind with clothes on. He had been transformed. He had been radically transformed, and that is what they do not want. They do not want this same transformative power exercised in this man to be exercised on them. You see, they are filled with fear. They recognize the power, and they are filled with fear. That the fear that Jesus had used to describe the disciples when they were fearing the storm, not the kind that depicts reverential fear. No, this faithless kind of fear. Then in verse 16, the whole story is retold, and so they begin to beg Jesus to leave them. They began to plead with him that he would go away. See, they refuse to be made like this man. They refuse to become the way that we are described in the Heidelberg Catechism. Heartily ready and willing from now on to live for Christ. That's what they don't want to be made into. And so they begin pleading. Just like the demons pleaded before, now they plead. And they say, please leave us alone. Please leave our country. Go away from us. We don't want to have your power in our midst. What does Jesus do? How does he respond? Again, without a word, he gives them their request. Look at verse 18. As he was getting into the boat. It's as simple as that. He doesn't respond to them by words. He does not say anything. He just leaves them. See, this is actually the picture of what hell is, in one sense. When God turns away his face, when he says, I will have nothing to do with you. I give you your desire. Jesus, essentially, without words, says to these people, as you wish, your will be done. You will not do my will, then do yours. That's what he says to them, without words. But then our passage comes to something of a climax in verses 18 to 20. We have a third person who comes to Jesus, another one who pleads with him. Another one who makes an earnest request. Actually, perhaps the first one to make a completely earnest request. The first request that we would say, that's the right thing to ask. And you say, surely Jesus will not give the demons what they ask and give the unfaithful what they ask. And then one of his own people, one of his, now essentially a disciple, comes to him and asks him for something good. And then Jesus surely wouldn't deny him. He gives everyone else what they want. Surely he will give to him, to this man, what he wants as well. Here again, the words of verses 18 to 20. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. And the story returns now to this man. This is being central to the story, but he hasn't said anything. In fact, what we have heard so far was the speaking of the demons through his mouth, but the man himself has not really said anything. We don't know anything about him yet. We know that he's been delivered from the demon possession, but now we hear him speak. And he asked Jesus that he might be with him. He has received this wonder, this miracle of being set free. Surely this man had given up hope that these demons would always be his boss, would always master him. Now he's free. He was bound, not by chains and shackles, but by the demons. And now he's truly free. Now he's truly free to be with Jesus, to be with his master, his new, good and merciful master. And all he wants is to be with him. That's what he asks. Let me be with you. But Jesus denies him that. Jesus says, no, I will give you something else. You see, you have become my servant. You are free. You are free to do my will. Previously, you were not free to do my will. Previously, you were dead in trespasses and sin. Previously, you were unable to do what I desire. But now, you are free to do my will. That is even a greater freedom perhaps than to be with Jesus and to have that desire fulfilled. You see, Jesus demonstrates to this man and to us that when he sets us free, we are free in order to do his will. We are free in order to obey him. And that's what the man does. That's exactly what he does. He does exactly what Jesus tells him to do. And the way that he does it actually shows us that he does this joyfully and thankfully for what Jesus had done for him. He doesn't grovel. He doesn't become bitter. How dare he not give me my desire? He gave the desires of the demons, and he gave the desires of the unfaithful people. How dare he not give me my desires? That's not what happens with this man. Instead, he does exactly what Jesus says. And he goes almost beyond what Jesus asked, but not in any bad kind of way. See, he comes to obey his new good master. Look how it's described. He goes to proclaim, to preach what Jesus had told him. Jesus said to him to tell them about how he had mercy on him, how much he had done for him. And then it's described in verse 20. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. Now I said that's almost beyond what Jesus required. Jesus had told him to go to your home, go to your own people. But he goes to the Decapolis. Now the Decapolis that's actually a region. Decapolis means, it's two words put together. Deca is the word 10, and polis is the word city. So this refers to the 10 cities. It's the region of the 10 cities on the eastern side of the Jordan River. All heathen nations lived there. And this man goes and he proclaims not only to his house and to his own friends, as Jesus said, but to the 10 cities. He becomes a wonderful missionary. We don't know, I think, anything else about him, but we know that he went to the 10 cities and he proclaimed the mercies of Christ to those people. You see, he had been set free. He had been set free to do the will of Christ. He was now, for the first time, truly free. And he used his freedom to do what his master desired of him. Previously, he could not be bound by chains. He was bound by the will of the evil one. Now he was set free in order to do the will of the Holy One. Now, again, we see exactly this in more theological terms in Ephesians 2, verse 8 to 10. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing, it is a gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God had prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. You see the beauty of the boundless authority of Jesus. Jesus has this great authority, and by this great authority, he, the great king, comes and he subdues this man to himself. And he subdues his enemies before him. But in this subduing, he sets free. He gives true freedom. To conclude, think about how gloriously this is summarized in the Westminster Shorter Catechism in question 26. The question is, how does Christ execute the office of a king? How does he show us that he is king? Christ executes his office, the office of a king, in subduing us to himself, in ruling and defending us, and in restraining and conquering all his and our enemies. Now in this passage, it's the other way around. Jesus had conquered all of his and our enemies. The demons were cast out. They went to their destruction. And this man was subdued to Jesus. Jesus had subdued him. He had brought him under his authority. And that was good for him. It set him free. So that he was now being ruled and defended by this great King, Jesus Christ. Amen.